By the time the snowstorm hit, the cowboy's firewood had long since turned to ash. The wind howled outside, but inside his cabin, the only thing that kept him from freezing was an old lantern trick he'd learned long ago. Before we ride further, tell us where you're listening from, and if Frontier Tales speak to you, hitch your horse at the channel and stay for tomorrow's story. The biting cold settled over the Dakota prairie like a suffocating blanket. Caleb Howard's cabin, nestled in the isolation of the frozen landscape, stood as a solitary shelter in the wild, surrounded by nothing but the blustering winds and a thick blanket of snow. Each gust of wind cut across the prairie like a blade, the chill creeping into the bones of every living creature. The warmth of the fire that had once filled the small stone cabin now seemed to be a distant memory. Caleb sat hunched over the dying embers of his hearth, the last log having burned to nothing but ash. A pile of firewood, carefully chopped and stacked weeks ago, now sat reduced to a mere handful of pieces. The winter had come fast, quicker than expected, and with it the harshest storm in years. The snowstorm outside was relentless, blanketing the world in a white, icy grip. His fingers, stiff with cold, slowly traced the edges of the stone fireplace as if willing the heat to return. He stared at the small pile of logs by the door, now too small to keep the fire going for another night. His heart sank as he considered his options. He had planned for this. He had thought ahead, believed he had enough firewood to last until the storm passed, but now it seemed like a cruel joke. With the wind howling and the temperatures plummeting, he knew he had only a few hours before the cabin would become unbearable. The horizon outside was buried beneath layers of snow, and the snow continued to fall, blinding, suffocating, merciless. Caleb pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders and leaned back against the stone wall. Every part of him ached, but it was the cold that gnawed at him most. The warmth of the fire, once the heart of the cabin, was fading, and the chill from the outside was steadily creeping in. His eyes lingered on the empty hearth, then moved to the worn lantern on the wooden table nearby. It was an old lantern, the kind every cowboy knew well, and for a moment Caleb's mind flickered back to the day he'd first seen how it worked, how it had saved a cowboy's life in the worst of storms. The memory was faint, but vivid enough to stir his thoughts. Caleb had always been self-reliant, believing that a man needed only himself to survive the wilds. Yet, the harsh realities of winter on the frontier often forced even the toughest of men to rethink their ideas of survival. As the wind rattled the windows, a small spark of hope flickered in Caleb's chest. Maybe this old trick would work for him, as it had for others. With a grunt, Caleb stood and grabbed the lantern. The oil inside still smelled faintly of pine. The flame flared as he lit it, its light cutting through the dim cabin like a small beacon of warmth. He moved it closer to the stone fireplace, where the last traces of the fire still fought to stay alive. This might just be enough to make it through the night. Caleb settled back onto the floor, his body leaning into the lantern's glow, and as the wind howled outside, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The storm raged on, but within the cabin, Caleb Howard wasn't yet defeated. Survival had always come down to knowing when to use what you had, and tonight he would have to rely on an old lantern trick to see him through. The fire had long since turned to embers, the last log consumed by the ravenous flames. Caleb sat in the corner of the cabin, his body wrapped tightly in a wool blanket, trying to squeeze whatever warmth he could from the little that remained in the stone hearth. The howling wind outside pressed against the walls like a living thing, its mournful cries seeping through the cracks and filling the cabin with the promise of more misery. Inside, the air felt thick with the weight of the storm, each breath a reminder of how cold the world had become. The heat from the lantern, now sitting beside him on the floor, was a lifeline, though its glow was dimming with each passing moment. Caleb had used lanterns countless times for light, but never for warmth. The trick was simple, an old habit he had learned from a fellow rider who, like most, had once scoffed at such a method. But after seeing it work through a brutal winter, Caleb had tucked it away in his mind, not knowing when he might need it, but knowing that sometimes survival came down to using the simplest tools. The lantern flickered weakly in the center of the room, casting long shadows across the walls. It wasn't enough to banish the cold, not nearly enough, but it was a small comfort. Caleb exhaled slowly, watching the fog of his breath dissipate in the dim light. His fingers, stiff from the cold, ached as they curled around the blanket. But the burning ache in his joints was nothing compared to the bone-deep chill that came from the storm outside. He hadn't meant to end up here alone, stranded in this small cabin, fighting to stay alive through a storm that felt as though it would never end. Caleb had grown used to the rough edges of the frontier, the isolation, the endless stretches of open land where a man could lose himself if he wasn't careful. But this was something different. This wasn't a season of hardship. This was a war between man and nature, and, right now, nature seemed to be winning. The warmth from the lantern trickled slowly into his bones, and Caleb found himself inching closer, trying to soak up every bit of heat the small flame offered. The wind outside didn't care about him, didn't care that his hands were numb, or that the firewood was gone, or that the storm might last for days. Nature had its own rules, its own way of deciding who lived and who didn't, and right now Caleb was up against those rules. He thought of the others, those who hadn't made it this far, those who hadn't prepared enough or had been caught off guard by the bitter, unyielding nature of the frontier. His father had warned him about the winters, had told him that no matter how tough a man was, there would always come a time when even the strongest would be forced to ask for help or find their own way to survive. Caleb glanced again at the lantern. The fire had always been his first line of defense, but in its absence, the lantern, this old, simple tool, was the only thing standing between him and the unrelenting cold outside. The storm clawed at the walls, but inside, Caleb wasn't yet defeated. Years ago, when Caleb had first ridden the frontier, he had encountered an older cowboy who had taught him the secret to surviving the harshest of winters with nothing but a lantern. The cowboy, a grizzled man named Hank, had been sitting by a fire one evening, the storm raging outside, when Caleb asked him about how he had survived the night. Hank had simply gestured to a small lantern sitting beside him. "Ever use one of these for more than light?" Hank had asked. Caleb had shaken his head, skeptical. A lantern was for light, nothing more. But Hank had smiled a crooked smile, his eyes glinting with a knowledge born from years of survival. "Watch this," Hank had said, and with a flick of his wrist, he had extinguished the fire. The night had been cold, the wind sharp against their skin, but Hank had placed the lantern close to the fire pit. The flame burned steady, casting a warm glow. Caleb had waited, expecting little more than a feeble attempt at warmth. But the room, cramped and bitterly cold just moments before, slowly began to warm. Caleb had felt it first in his hands, then his face, as the warmth from the lantern began to fill the space. It was faint, but it was enough. By morning, the fire in the hearth had been cold, but the lantern had kept the chill at bay. Caleb had watched Hank work the trick again and again through that long, bitter winter. It wasn't much, but in moments of desperation, it was enough to keep the frostbite at bay, to keep the cabin livable for one more night. Now, here Caleb sat, in the midst of his own storm, relying on the same trick. The wind howled louder than ever, rattling the windows and threatening to tear through the walls. His firewood had long since dwindled to nothing, and with no more logs to feed the flames, he was left with only the lantern. He could still hear Hank's voice in his head, the old cowboy's words echoing in the silence of the cabin. "Build for the worst you can imagine. And when the worst comes, hope you're wrong." Caleb hadn't been wrong yet. The storm outside was the worst he'd ever seen, but the lantern was doing its job. Slowly, imperceptibly, the cold that had gripped him began to loosen. It wasn't enough to chase away the storm or turn the cabin into a haven, but the little flame brought relief. It was a small victory against the elements. As the night stretched on, Caleb sat quietly, letting the warmth of the lantern seep into his bones. He wasn't sure how long it would last, he never was, but for now it was enough. The storm had no answer for this small, old trick, not tonight, not yet. As Caleb huddled near the lantern's glow, the memories of fire began to resurface. Memories of his childhood spent in the mountains of Wyoming. There, fire was more than a comfort, it was a necessity. He could still recall how the flames would dance in the hearth of his family's cabin, crackling as they warmed the room and their spirits. His father had always said that a man could survive almost anything on the frontier, but he couldn't survive without fire. Back then, fire was the answer to nearly every problem. It provided heat in the freezing winter nights, cooked meals, and warded off the wild animals that prowled just beyond the reach of the cabin. Caleb had grown up knowing the intimate relationship between flame and survival. When the wind howled and the snow piled up, fire became a symbol of safety, of everything that made the wilderness bearable. Caleb had always prided himself on his ability to handle the challenges of the frontier, on being able to fix a broken wagon wheel, to mend a tear in his coat, or to start a fire with nothing more than a few matches. Fire had always been a constant in his life, an old friend that never failed him, until now. Here, in this small cabin on the Dakota plains, fire was now a rarity. He had spent weeks chopping and stacking firewood, convinced it would be enough to last the winter. But now, as the lantern flickered weakly, Caleb realized that his reliance on the fire had been a mistake. It wasn't the firewood that had failed him, it was the storm. The blizzard outside had swept in so quickly that even the most prepared settler had been caught off guard. Caleb's hands clenched around the wool blanket, and he shivered despite the warmth from the lantern. He thought back to his father's lessons, the way he had always insisted on being ready for any eventuality. It had seemed like common sense at the time, but now Caleb couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of failure. He had thought he had prepared for everything, every storm, every hardship, but here he was, trapped by a blizzard that showed no sign of abating. The wind howled outside again, louder this time, as though the storm itself was mocking him. Caleb's eyes drifted back to the lantern, and a flicker of guilt gnawed at him. It wasn't fire, not the kind he had known as a child. It was a poor substitute, but it was all he had now. And yet, despite the isolation, the endless snow, and the uncertainty of the storm's end, Caleb felt a strange sense of resolve. It was not the fire that mattered, nor the lack of it. It was the will to survive. His father had always said that, too. The frontier didn't care what tools you had, it only cared if you could adapt. Caleb looked at the lantern one more time, its small flame now steady in the quiet cabin. And somehow, that was enough. The hours bled into each other, the night stretching longer than Caleb had ever thought possible. The storm outside raged on, its fury unrelenting, but inside the cabin, Caleb held on. The lantern continued to burn, the weak light a flickering reminder of how fragile his situation had become. Despite its warmth, the cold never truly left. It clung to the walls, to the corners of the room, and to Caleb's very bones. He had tried to sleep, but the howling wind kept his mind racing. Every creak of the wood, every gust against the roof, felt like a warning, a reminder that out there, beyond the safety of his small cabin, the storm had no mercy. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push the cold from his thoughts. But the silence of the cabin only amplified the sound of his own breathing. The lantern, though it had been a lifeline, felt like it was growing weaker with every passing hour. He had nothing left to feed the flame, but the oil inside, and soon that would run dry too. The wood of the walls groaned in protest as the storm battered it. Caleb's heart sank as he listened to the wind whistle through every crack, every crevice. It was a familiar sound. He had heard it many times before in the open range, but now, here in the confines of his cabin, it was different. It wasn't just the wind. It was the cold creeping through every gap in his shelter, trying to get inside, trying to claim him. As the storm howled louder, Caleb's thoughts turned to his past. He had faced storms before, but never one like this. His mind wandered back to the winters of his youth, when he had watched his father, stoic and unflinching, prepare the family cabin against the elements. Caleb had learned much from those years, how to build, how to survive, but in this moment, none of those lessons seemed to matter. The storm was bigger than any of them. It was a reminder that nature, no matter how much a man thought he could control it, always had the final say. The wind outside became more frantic, and Caleb could feel the temperature inside the cabin begin to drop. His breath, once steady, became visible, misting in the dim lantern light. He could see the cold creeping into the corners of the room, could feel it on his face, his fingers. Every part of him screamed to add more wood to the fire, but the fire was long gone. He had nothing left. He glanced at the lantern again. It was still burning, its small flame a fragile shield against the darkness outside. Caleb knew it wouldn't last much longer. And then, he thought, he would be forced to face the storm with nothing but the coat on his back and the stubborn will to survive. The toll of the storm was wearing on him, testing his resolve. The storm was relentless. But as Caleb's eyes fell on the lantern, he knew something. It didn't matter how long the storm lasted. He would hold on. The lantern wasn't much, but it was enough to get him through one more night. By the time dawn finally broke through the storm, Caleb was a shadow of himself. His body was stiff from the cold, his mind fogged by the endless hours of isolation, but the faint light creeping through the frosted windows brought a glimmer of hope. The wind outside had started to weaken, its once deafening roar now a low whine, as though the storm was tiring of its assault. Caleb's eyes, heavy with exhaustion, flickered open as he listened to the wind's gradual retreat. The lantern beside him was still burning, though its light was weaker now, struggling against the limited oil. Caleb's fingers ached as he moved to stoke the flame, a futile effort to keep it alive a little longer. The warmth from it had faded, and the cabin was now a cold, silent tomb, save for the occasional creak of the walls under the pressure of the storm. He hadn't felt warmth in hours, but there was something in the light that comforted him, a reminder that he hadn't yet been beaten. Through the thin gap in the window, Caleb could see the first light of morning, pale and weak, but unmistakable. The storm, while not over, had loosened its grip on the land. It wasn't the blazing, fiery sunrise that he had hoped for, but it was enough. A part of him, exhausted from the cold, feared that the storm might return with a vengeance, but for now, this was a moment of calm. He rose slowly, his muscles stiff from the long night spent hunched against the chill. His boots scraped against the rough wooden floor as he moved to the door, cautiously opening it just a crack. A rush of cold air greeted him, sharp and biting, but it was tempered by the faint promise of respite. Caleb's breath fogged in the cold as he stepped outside, squinting against the pale morning light. The snow had piled high around the cabin, thick drifts reaching almost to his knees. But it wasn't the same wall of white that had kept him trapped for so long. The wind had calmed, and through the swirling snowflakes he could see the barest outline of the prairie. The land, once a vast, unyielding wilderness, was now a quiet, snow-covered expanse, still and eerily calm. There were no signs of life, no movement beyond the sway of the branches caught in the breeze. But the silence, oddly comforting, brought with it a sense of clarity. The storm had not yet fully passed, but Caleb could feel a shift. It was a faint stir of hope, one that didn't come with grand promises, but with quiet determination. The cabin, though still cold, seemed less threatening now. The worst of it was over. The lantern had lasted the night, a simple trick he had learned long ago, and though it had barely held the cold at bay, it had been enough. Enough to survive. As Caleb stood there in the stillness of the morning, the first real peace he had known in days settled over him. The storm, though cruel, had shown him something vital. He had made it through, and for now that was enough. The morning passed slowly, the stillness outside the cabin somehow more unnerving than the storm had been. Caleb moved around the cabin, trying to find something to occupy his mind. The cold was not as sharp as it had been the night before, but it still lingered in the corners, a constant reminder of the battle between warmth and winter. The lantern, though still burning weakly, had become the focal point of the cabin. The flickering flame was no longer just a tool. It was a symbol of his perseverance, a fragile yet unwavering promise of survival. Caleb's eyes often drifted to it, the small, fragile flame that had burned steady throughout the night. It had given him enough warmth to keep the worst of the cold at bay, enough light to see through the long hours of the storm. The heat had been meager, but the trick had worked. The storm outside, though still relentless, no longer seemed like an undefeatable force. Caleb knew the storm would not last forever. He had survived it. The lantern had given him that. He walked over to the window, his boots creaking against the floorboards. The snow had begun to taper off, the once violent gusts of wind now only an occasional whisper. Caleb could see the tracks left by the storm's fury, drifts of snow piled high against the walls, a blank canvas that stretched across the prairie. The land was still wild, untouched by civilization, but in its desolation it held a kind of quiet peace. The lantern, now standing on the table in the center of the room, seemed to pulse with a quiet power. Caleb had always trusted his instincts on the frontier, and they told him something now. The storm might have taken everything, firewood, food, warmth, but it had left him with something more essential, the ability to adapt. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs as it entered, but for the first time in what felt like days, Caleb didn't feel the weight of the storm pressing in on him. He felt lighter. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was the simple fact that he was still here alive despite the odds. Despite everything that had gone wrong, he was still standing, still breathing. The lantern's light didn't promise that things would get better, but it was enough to remind him that there was always a way forward. Caleb wasn't sure how long he would be stuck here. He couldn't say when the storm would end or when he'd have enough supplies to make it to the next settlement. But he knew this. The lantern had kept him alive through the night, and it would keep him alive until the storm passed. It was a promise, not of ease or comfort, but of survival. It wasn't much, but sometimes when you were out on the frontier, it was enough. And Caleb would hold on to that as long as he could. Caleb had hoped for a break in the weather, a small window of peace where he could gather his bearings and perhaps make a move toward the nearest settlement. But as the hours passed, the storm didn't let up. It softened at times, only to regain its strength as quickly as it had lost it. Caleb watched from the window, the snow swirling and dancing in the wind like 1,000 white ghosts. The air outside was still frigid, and while the cabin was more tolerable than the night before, it wasn't yet a refuge. The lantern had burned for most of the day, the oil inside slowly running low, but Caleb hadn't dared snuff it out. He couldn't afford to lose even the faintest warmth. He had tried to ration the oil, but it was becoming a game of survival. Each flicker of the flame an echo of how little he had left to rely on. The thought of running out of fuel and being left in total darkness made his stomach tighten with fear. But the thought of freezing to death was even worse. The cold was insidious. It crept into his limbs, a slow, creeping numbness that didn't let up. He pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, but even the thick wool couldn't keep the chill at bay for long. Caleb had spent enough time on the frontier to know that the cold didn't just steal warmth, it stole hope piece by piece, until a man was left alone with nothing but his instincts. That's all Caleb had now. His instincts and the meager supplies he had left in the cabin. The flour and dried meat in his stores would last for a little while, but the real challenge would come when the storm had gone. The food wouldn't last long enough to make it to the next settlement. He knew he would have to make a move, eventually, but that would have to wait. The storm wasn't finished with him yet. He moved back to the table, adjusting the lantern to conserve what little oil it had left. The room was dim now, the glow from the lantern just enough to cast long, faint shadows on the walls. The howling wind outside had become a constant hum in the background, like the voice of an angry, relentless beast. Caleb's stomach growled, but it wasn't hunger that kept him on edge, it was the relentless pull of the storm. The isolation of being trapped in the cabin, with no way out and no way to know how long it would last, was a pressure that bore down on his chest. Caleb hadn't been afraid of storms before. In fact, he had always found comfort in the rhythm of nature. But this storm was different. This one was a test, and he wasn't sure yet whether he was passing or failing. As the night stretched on, Caleb sat beside the lantern, the wind roaring louder and the cold creeping further into the cabin. The storm might have him trapped for now, but he wasn't out of the fight yet. Not yet. The storm seemed to lose its edge as the night wore on, its ferocity fading into a soft, almost mournful whisper. The howling wind had dwindled to a low rumble, and for the first time in what felt like days, Caleb allowed himself to sleep. The warmth from the lantern had held steady through the night, though faint, and the brief reprieve from the storm brought with it a sense of calm. When Caleb woke, the cabin was still cold, but the relentless wind had finally stopped. A layer of frost covered the windows, but the light outside was different now, softer and warmer than the harsh glare of the storm. It was early morning, and the first rays of sunlight pierced the heavy clouds overhead. Caleb could hardly believe it. The worst of the storm had passed. His body ached from the cold and exhaustion, but his mind was clear. He had made it through the night, and with the storm dying down, he knew he could make it through the day. The cabin, though still chilled, felt less like a prison and more like a place where he could rebuild. The lantern had done its job. It had kept him alive, and now, it seemed to him, it was time to move forward. As Caleb stood up and stretched his stiff muscles, he walked over to the window. Outside, the prairie was a bleak landscape of snow, its surface broken only by the occasional drift or the tracks of some animal that had braved the storm. But the sky was clearing, and the sun, though still weak, brought a sense of promise. Caleb's heart quickened with cautious hope. The storm had come hard, but it had also left something behind, a landscape that, though harsh, was now passable. The struggle for warmth and survival had been long and trying, but Caleb knew that the worst was over. The storm had tested him, but it had also revealed something vital. He had survived, not through brute force or sheer will alone, but through cleverness, patience, and reliance on what little he had. He thought back to the lantern. The simple, humble tool had kept him alive when all seemed lost. It wasn't a grand solution, but it was a life-saving one, and it had shown him that sometimes survival didn't require much more than the will to adapt. He grabbed the lantern, its flame still flickering weakly. The oil inside was nearly gone, but the warmth from the flame had been enough to see him through the worst of it. The storm was no longer a threat. It was a challenge that had been met. Caleb had survived, and in doing so, he had reclaimed something he had almost lost, his belief in his ability to endure no matter the odds. The light from the lantern no longer felt as fragile. It felt like a promise. And with that promise, Caleb knew the next steps would be easier, if not easy, at least possible. The storm was finally gone, leaving only the still, frozen silence of the prairie behind. Caleb stood in the doorway of the cabin, squinting against the weak light of the early morning. The sky was clearing, the heavy gray clouds dissipating as the sun, still low and pale, began to rise. The wind had dropped, and the world outside was muffled, as if the snow had absorbed all sound, leaving only the faint crunch of his boots as he stepped outside. He surveyed the land, the once turbulent wilderness now a quiet expanse of snow and ice. The trees, stripped of their foliage by the winter, stood like silent sentinels, their branches bowed under the weight of the storm. The tracks of a few animals dotted the snow foxes, rabbits, and perhaps a coyote, evidence that life had continued through the storm, even if Caleb hadn't been sure he would. He felt the cold bite at his skin as he stepped farther out into the snow, but it wasn't the same cold as before. This was the cold of a new day, one where survival had already been earned. The storm had pushed him to his limit, but it hadn't taken everything. Caleb could feel his body protesting the cold, but his mind was clear, his spirit stronger than it had been in days. He had faced down the worst of the storm and emerged from it alive, something not every man could say in the unforgiving world of the frontier. He glanced back at the cabin, its roof heavy with snow, the chimney puffing out a thin stream of smoke from the last embers. The lantern that had kept him warm through the long night sat beside the door, its flame now snuffed out, but its legacy still flickering in his mind. It hadn't been much, but it had been enough. In the end, that was all that mattered. The simple things, the lantern, the fire, the will to keep moving forward, had kept him alive. For the first time in days, Caleb allowed himself a deep breath, one that wasn't tinged with fear or desperation. He wasn't out of the woods yet. There was still much to be done. The storm had taken its toll, and his supplies were dwindling, but for now, the worst was behind him. The storm had tested him, but it had also taught him something valuable, that survival didn't always come with grand gestures or mighty feats of strength. Sometimes it was enough to hold on, to trust the tools you had, and to find warmth in the smallest of flames. The horizon was still bleak, the prairie endless and harsh, but Caleb didn't feel its weight as much anymore. He felt the weight of the storm lifting, the promise of a day that would carry him forward, even if only a little at a time. The world wasn't kind, but it was always a little more bearable after the storm passed. Caleb turned back toward the cabin, the cold air fresh in his lungs. It wasn't much, but it was enough, and that was all he needed.